1, 2. Hello. Why is it not letting me in? You guys have this class, this room? You guys have this room on? Because I think IT.
What?
You guys have this room in the week?
It's tomorrow.
Does your professor got issues like logging in and they keep
No.
on kicking her out? Then it's just me. Well,
That is a fact, not an opinion.
I mean, are they technologically advanced, or are they not?
Not.
Oh, okay. So I'm in the club. Great. I'm also being recorded. Lovely. All right. Let us.
If you ask for help, I help you, but if you ask for help,
Oh, stop. You're being recorded. All right. Chapter 9. We'll just edit that out. Chapter 9, muscular. And you see what this textbook did, right? It went over the tissues, and now we're going to the next level, right? And then they listed what connective tissue, muscular. So now we're going to talk about the muscles. And of course, we know already skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal, also known as striated, because they have little stripes. And of course, they're voluntary. They're attached to bone. They're for movement. Cardiac muscle, of course, they're involuntary, and they're pumping action of the heart. And that was the one from the quiz that had a sensation, because cardiac muscle, what's special about it is it contracts on its own, and it does it like to a beat. So that's something special for that particular category. And last but not least, smooth muscle, also known as visceral muscle. They don't have the stripes, and we cannot control them. And how you remember that is when you swallow, can you stop it from going down your esophagus? They can't. When you're in a meeting and you have all those horrible sounds coming from your stomach and from your intestines, have you any control over any of that? You do not. And that's smooth muscle. Once you put the food in your mouth, all of it is automatic. Skeletal muscles, yada, 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 it goes, of course, conscious control. We already talked about how everything that we saw in the bones and other things always had an artery, a vein, and a nerve. We noticed that, right? And we already now know that the nerves send signals up to my brain to process it. Well, we remember they send signals down, and that was the motor / effector pathway, and that's what connects the skeletal muscles. And so in order for your skeletal muscle to work, you need a brain, you need a descending pathway, an effector, and of course you need a working muscle. And all muscles do is contract, get smaller. That's all they do. And of course we already know we have connective tissue to make sure all of it's in place. And we already know ligaments versus tendons. And tendon is a muscle that connects to a bone. So if I have a muscular problem, can I move my tendon? Nope. If I have a connective tissue problem, can I move my arm? Nope. If I have a bone problem, can I move my arm? Nope. If I have a brain problem, will I able to send a signal on the effector pathway to move my arm? Nope. If I also have a spinal problem or a descending effector pathway problem, can I not move my arm? So now you can see kind of the complexity of how, even though we study all of these systems separately, they're all related. And now you also now have a little taste of the complexity of what the physician has to do to get to the diagnosis or get to the root of the problem. Because when you come in, you say, I can't move my arm. To a physician, that's what? There's a million and two things that I have to think about. And also you as future nurses as well, because how many times you're going to be the one to give me that data. So of course, because we need nervous tissue, I need blood, of course. Remember, artery and vein? I've got to bring the muscle oxygen, don't I? And my muscle, when I move and do stuff, doesn't it burn out ATP? And if I'm making ATP, don't I also kick out carbon dioxide and lactic acid. So I need veins to get rid of that as well. So when you look at this list, don't really have to memorize it. You kind of like put all the pieces together and know that in order for a muscle to happen, all of these things have to happen. Now, if we look at the muscle, this is how I remember it. I remember it, and sorry, those of you who haven't eaten yet, join the club. Gained a couple of pounds in the last week, so now I got to go back to the original rabbit food diet. But I'm thinking right now of Popeye's chicken and the drumstick. So we already know the connective tissue, right? We already know the skin. Okay, that's fine. But under the skin, isn't there another skin? Right? And my daughter calls it the underskin. So when you remove that delicious, crunchy, salty goodness, which is the breaded part, you see that shiny part that's underneath it? That's your fascia. You'll notice that thin covering of connective tissue, that fascia, is then connected to your tendon. And we now know the tendon on our drumstick, we can follow that and it connects to the bone part, doesn't it? Now, the aponeurosis, right? It's also part of that fascia and tendon that connects muscle to bone. But the two more clinically relevant ones are fascia and tendon. The aponeurosis is like kind of like in between all of that. But the fascia definitely is that second skin, and that's what's going to cover the muscle on the very outside. And then the fascia comes together and to form a tendon, which is like a string that connects the muscle to the bone. And we already saw that in laboratory. So let's say, let's look at my fingers, and this is flexion, because we already know that's decreasing the angle of my fingers, right? From 180 to 90, and I'm to less than 45 for me to close. And everyone feel, when you're feeling this, when you're moving your fingers around, you feel little things moving around here, right? That's what, that's all the fascia that's connected to all these muscles. They come and form this like a rope, and then, right, the muscles here pull on that rope, and what will it do? It'll close your hand so you can go grab things. And of course, here's a lovely, right here, it's a lovely layers question. And I don't have to look at the picture yet to know what it is. So I have an epimysium, right? So that's got to be the outer part of the muscle. Is a structure of, epi means right on top. Right underneath the epimysium is the perimysium that surrounds a fascicle. And we're going to show you what that means. But let's look at the words first. And last but not least, the endomysium, that's got to be the covering where? On the inside. So I could ask you, what's the very, very top covering of the muscle? Epimysium. Okay? Underneath it, what's surrounding all the little wires and stuff? And we're going to show you how muscle is essentially like a big piece of rope. And that's your perimysium. And fascicles is one of those pieces of rope. And it'll make sense in a moment. And then last but not least, your endomysium. Endo is where? On the very inside. So that's a lovely, and you know, in anatomy and physiology, layers questions are always good. Now, this is what I was talking about, how it looks like rope. Look at this part. So when you're looking at a muscle, it's essentially what? A wire wrapped around another wire, wrapped around another wire, and just like string, right? I could take a little piece of string, right? I could take it and just break it with my hand, right? But if you've ever seen what rope looks like, it's just what? A whole bunch of string all bound together like a braid. Does that look familiar? Like this? So how much easier would it to pull on something, right? And it won't, and it'll be harder to break. So if you look at this, the very, very tippy top, right here, of course, you have the fascia that connects into the, makes a tendon and then connects the bone. But underneath the fascia, you have the first layer, which is the epimysium. And then you have these separate pieces of rope, and one separate piece of rope is called your fascicle. So you have the whole muscle, and then the next level is called the fascicle. And if you see the fascicle, what's covering all the fascicles? Perimysium. Of course, there's got to be an artery, vein, and nerve. That makes sense, right? The nerve has to tell my muscle, hey, time to contract, right? The artery has to give the muscle oxygen. The vein has to then take away what? Carbon dioxide, because the muscle's going to use all of that. And when you see that, what's the inner layer? The endomysium. Now, when you look at it, it gets into fibers and gets smaller and smaller. So when you look at a muscle, it's essentially a rope within another rope, like a kind of like a braid. And if you've ever looked at a really big rope, all it is what? A bunch of threads being braided around, a bunch of other braids, and then that rope is very strong. And that's why your muscles are also very strong, and it's also difficult to tear one of these. Now, remember we talked about ions that turn things on and turn things off? Well, calcium is one of those things that has to turn things on, okay? And then in order for my muscle to happen, right? When I'm thinking about closing my hand, I'm thinking about it, and it's got to happen in milliseconds, right? Especially, you know, someone's throwing money at me, and I got to catch it, right? Or like, you ever see that thing where, last time I was in Atlantic City, I saw some friends do that wind tunnel thing where they have to try to catch the money. Did you guys ever do that? Right? Which is a scam, by the way, because most of the bills are dollar bills, right? So, okay, fine. You call it like a whole 8 bills. Now you're like $8 richer, which is silly. But when you see that thing, or anytime, have you ever caught something without even thinking about it? Like it fell off the table? Mm-hmm. I always use the term ninja because I was like, when something falls off the table, I'm like, oh, now that has to happen. Remember, your nervous system happens what? Milliseconds, very, very fast. So back to my story here. The sarcoplasmic reticulum has a bunch of calcium in it because when did I need this stuff to get turned on? The second that signal comes, that calcium better rush in so I can do what? Grab what I need to grab. Or you guys ever, those of you who have children, ever catch a kid like in mid-fall? You're like, ah, right? And you catch them at the last minute because why? That pathway we talked about, what was the stimulus? You saw something wrong. You saw them falling, right? Then your brain did what? Processed it. Then sent the signal down to your motor to do what? Go grab, go catch that thing. Which, by the way, if you do something repetitively, do you need your brain anymore? Right? No, like, and those are called reflexes. And then the next chapter, we'll talk about when you don't need this. When there's things that happen automatically, and we already talked about that. If you've ever, fried catfish, and then the oil goes on your hand, you pull away your hand and your entire body before you even feel the pain, before you even feel the oil. And all of that is due to things like the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It already stores calcium, so we don't have to tell the bone, go break down, go release it, send it to me. It's too long, isn't it? Right? I want it when? Now. And you can see the smallest is a filament, and then it turns into a myofibril, so filament, then it went to fibers, and then after the fibers then bound together, and then you have, these fascicles, and a whole bunch of fascicles come together, and then it's a big muscle. And we kind of already seen that in bone. We've seen that in epidermal cells, that like one little thing builds, and then it builds into a next level, to the next level, to the next level. So this is a beautiful picture for lab, but what kind of questions could come out? I could ask you a layers question. Epimysium, perimysium, endomysium. I could ask you, how is this thing so fast? How did it contract so quickly and so forcibly? Well, there's calcium already there in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. I could ask you a size thing. What's the smallest part of your muscle? Well, it could be a single filament. And a whole bunch of filaments make a whole bunch of myofibrils. A whole bunch of myofibrils can make a muscle fiber. and a whole bunch of fibers get put together, can make a fascicle. A whole bunch of fascicles make an entire muscle. So that's what that picture is good for. So of course, it's multinucleated, has a lot of nucleuses. We already talked about the sarcoplasm. Oopsies, didn't mean that. Transverse tubules, nice to know. Know also that the brain, those signals, the sensory signals, are electrical signals. And the effector motor signals are also electrical signals. So your muscle responds to electrical signals. And those of you who've ever been tased know that what? The electrical signals have to be organized. But if you get tased and they're unorganized, what happens? Right? You'll just, it's not coordinated, right? Same thing with also seizure disorder. If you have a seizure disorder, are the signals going down to the muscle coordinated? No. If you've ever seen somebody in a seizure, a grand mal seizure, they'll start shaking, right? And they kind of stiffen up and then they'll fall over, and they have no control over that. So you got these things called T tubules that are connected to the electrical impulses and also connected to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So it is that electricity, right? And remember we talked about the brain, it moves through electricity and chemicals. Well, so does the muscle. Muscle reacts to electricity, and then the electricity tells, remember we talked about voltage gated channel? Then you tell the sarcoplasmic reticulum to do what? Open up, let all that calcium out, and let all of it out quickly. And then you got T tubules that makes it go all around. Now we're looking at a muscle fiber, and of course we have the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You're going to see there's these little proteins. So this stuff, these blue lines, let's make it a little bit bigger. You see there's these blue lines and then these purple lines, or thick and thin filaments. So I want you to see a muscular fiber, they're like this. And remember, the only thing that a muscle does is do what? Contract or get smaller. So when that calcium comes and makes the signal, what's it going to do? It's going to pull together, and then the muscle's going to get shorter. So that's all a muscle does, is contract. And it does it through these thick and thin filaments. And these thick and thin filaments, they form these like I band, A band, or whatever. That's not important. Just know that these are proteins, and we're going to name them in a minute. You have a thick one and a thin one. And then what will they do? They pull on each other, and then they make the whole muscle shorter. And that's all that muscles do. So, whoopsie. So ignore this, I band, A band, H zone. We don't care about that. We care about this. You have thick and thin filaments. Now the thick filaments are called myosin, and the thin filaments are called actin. This is how I've remembered it since EMS days. I always call actin, actin, right? Like with a lisp. So it's what? The thin filaments. So it's the thinner purple filaments. And the thick filaments, filaments, that's myosin. So it's one of those things, actin and myosin. Memorize one like your life depended on it, and the other one's the other. And you could see here how they're kind of interlaced like this. And then I'm gonna show you a video in a minute on how they move together and how this whole muscle fiber is going to get smaller. So if the muscle fiber gets smaller, don't you think everything else is all going to compress and get smaller? And that's its function. So you have thick filaments, of course, myosin, and thin filaments. Now, what do they look like? They look like this. So you have the myosin, the thick filament, and then you have the actin, which is the thin filament. And then they have these little myosin heads that form these cross bridges. And we're gonna look at a video in a second. You see how this is gonna, use your imagination now. This thing is gonna kind of like attach to it, and then they're gonna pull. And then if they pull, everything is gonna get smaller. So let's look at a nice video. YouTube.
Creating your first video? You should start with the music. Go to artlist.io and get high quality music and sound effects for
Muscle contraction is at the basis of all skeletal movements. Skeletal muscles are composed of muscle fibers, which in turn are made of repetitive functional units called sarcomeres. Each sarcomere contains many parallel overlapping thin, actin, and thick myosin filaments. The muscle contracts when these filaments slide past each other, resulting in a shortening of the sarcomere and thus the muscle. This is known as the sliding filament theory. Cross-bridge cycling forms the molecular basis for this sliding movement. Muscle contraction is initiated when muscle fibers are stimulated by a nerve impulse and calcium ions are released. The troponin units on the actin myofilaments are bound by calcium ions. The binding displaces tropomyosin along the myofilaments, which in turn exposes the myosin binding sites. At this stage, the head of each myosin unit is bound to an ADP and a phosphate molecule remaining from the previous muscular contraction. The myosin heads release these phosphates and bind to the actin myofilaments via the newly exposed myosin binding sites. The two myofilaments glide past one another, propelled by a head-first movement of the myosin units, powered by the chemical energy stored in their heads. As the units move, they release the ADP molecules bound to their heads. The gliding motion is halted when ATP molecules bind to the myosin heads, thus severing the bonds between myosin and actin. The ATP molecules are now decomposed into ADP and phosphate, with the energy released by this reaction stored in the myosin heads, ready to be used in the next cycle of movement. The myosin heads resume their starting positions along the actin myofilament and can now begin a new sequence of actin binding. The presence of further calcium ions will trigger a new cycle.
So when you look at this, let me pan back a little bit.
Is halted when AT.
So now we already know things from other chapters. First of all, now you know why calcium turns some things on. Calcium has to change the actin, which is the thin filament. Don't worry about tropomyosin, troponin. Just know that the first requirement is what? Calcium. And we know that calcium turns muscle on, right? So the actin now is changed. Now that once the actin is changed, right? We also know that we need ATP. We need it for energy. Now we can now see that ATP by itself isn't energy. But when ATP gets cut into ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, right? That one phosphate kicks out, that's when you have the power stroke, right? That's when that thing moves. And if there's calcium still there, what happens? Another ATP will go on, right? And then do what? Attach. And then, did you see there was an ATPase? What's that? That has to be an enzyme that's going to break down the ATP to what? ADP and that single phosphate. So what are the two things required? I need calcium and I need ATP. If I have both, what will happen? Those heads will start doing what? Will start moving, and then the filaments, the thin and the thick, will start doing what? They'll start passing each other, and then and that word sarcomere just means that section of muscle is going to get smaller. But do this and it's multiplied all throughout the entire muscle, so the whole entire muscle will do what? Shrink. So what kind of questions could come out from this video? I could ask, what is required for muscle contraction? Calcium, right? Where does calcium bind to? Actin, right? It changes the actin. Where is the ATP bind to? myosin, or the thick filament, this thing, right? ATP turns into ADP. Then we all know that if I break a phosphate bond, what's it going to do? Energy. Enough energy to do what? Make the myosin heads move the actin just a little bit over. And it does that what? Like a million times. Until when? The whole entire muscle gets shorter. And that's contraction. And that's and it's, I don't know why they keep on calling it a theory. It's not a theory, it's actually what happens. Now you can see that, let's say my patient's heart isn't beating as forcefully or as quickly as I want it to, right? Let's say they're having bradycardia. Don't you think I'm going to put calcium carbonate in their line? So what's that going to do? It's going to turn things on, and and now you also know why there has to be a sarcoplasmic reticulum right on the muscle, because I can't wait for the calcium to get there. The calcium has to be released when? The second I need it. So so my heart can beat, so I can swallow that burger. I can digest that burger, and also so I can move when I need to. And that is muscle contraction. So now, when we look at this picture, it makes a little bit more sense now. Like, oh, the myosin has these heads that has ATP on it and ADP on it, right? The thin filament has calcium on it. Tropomyosin, troponin, those are these, and you can see how it's built by little circles. If we took a microscope to this thing is built by a whole bunch of little circles, because guess what all of this is? Proteins. And now we know exactly how to make proteins and how we make all of this. So that's contraction of the muscle fiber, and of course, if you multiply that, it's going to be contraction of the entire thing. So we now know it requires not only electrical, but also chemical. I move the myofibrils, the actin and myosin, I move them, it'll get smaller. Now, we now have to talk about the electricity of it all. And we already know that the effector side of our homeostasis diagram, right, brain, and then descending fiber, well, we have to talk about how the nerve connects into a muscle. And it actually explains a lot about pharmacology. So let's focus on this part right here. So right now, this is a nerve ending. And on this side, this is muscle side. So this is what happens. You have electricity, and it's called an action potential. Right? Your brain sends out an electrical signal to your muscle. Okay? Now, when it gets to your muscle, you see it's gonna make synaptic vesicles, and these synaptic vesicles, they have neurotransmitter in it. Remember we talked about that when we were talking about organelles and the Golgi complex, how it packages things? Well, the Golgi has pre-packaged set of stuff, and this is this chemical is a neurotransmitter. And what does neurotransmitter mean? Nerve, to transmit. Trans means to go across. So it goes across this little cleft or gap. And that's called your synaptic cleft or synaptic gap. Once it reaches on the other side, the neurotransmitter has receptors. Remember we talked about receptors? It was like a door opening. So this neurotransmitter is like a key to make the door open. Well, the door for this case is the muscle contraction. Open up the sarcoplasmic reticulum, get some calcium, and do you notice what there's a lot of? There's mitochondria everywhere. Because don't you think it's going to take a lot of energy to package all of this stuff in a timely manner? By the way, this packaging happens in milliseconds. And to deliver it across this little space here, and then for the muscle to go do something. And so it starts off electrical, then goes to chemical, and then we already now know back in the muscle, it turns back to electricity. The electricity then tells the calcium to go release, and then we have what? Muscle contraction. So the neurotransmitter here is acetylcholine, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. But this is also the basis for a lot of drugs. So let's say, for example, I have an action potential or electricity from my brain that's supposed to tell my body, hey, be happy, right? Or how's this? I have a signal from my brain that's sending out neurotransmitters like GABA, right? GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, and GABA is a depressant. So it's telling my body to feel what? Depressed, tired, sad. Don't you think we have chemicals that can block this? Right? Or how about if it's dopamine? And we already talked about the neurotransmitter dopamine. Isn't dopamine already implicated in love? Every February they always talk about that. How dopamine, like chocolate, releases dopamine, which is, by the way, a lie. It doesn't. But, you know, it makes you feel better. Yes, it does. But dopamine is implicated in what? Depression. So is serotonin. So what if I had a neurotransmitter or drugs, and you guys heard of a whole bunch of them, right? Like what? Ambien, Haldol, Zoloft, Xanax. It's all it is what? A whole bunch of chemicals running through that gap to make you do and feel things, right? Same thing with a neuromuscular blocker, right? Anyone ever take a neuromuscular blocker, right? Or a muscle relaxant, right? Yeah. How'd you feel? Don't you feel loose, right? Like you can't move around, but you feel, oh, right? You don't feel tense but don't think too much because, again, too much of a good thing, bad thing. So this is acetylcholine, and that's what tells the muscle, hey, time to contract, time to release that calcium, time to release that ATP. Let's see. So you could see how it's connected to the muscle. And of course, motor descending fiber, also known as your motor neuron, because that's a nerve that will send the signal. And now you know this is a descending, and then the motor end plate ends up where? Of course, in a muscle fiber. And that's why we saw that other picture. Muscles always have arteries, veins, and nerves. Now, if I cut this thing, right, will I ever be able to contract anything? No, right? So, cut you right here. Can I move my hand? No, it's done. So that's a motor neuron. That's a descending fiber. It's going to tell the muscle what to do, and it starts off electrical, right? There's electricity, electricity, electricity until it gets to here. Then it becomes chemical. That's the neurotransmitter. And the example for neurotransmission regarding the motor end plate or the motor nerve that connects to a muscle is acetylcholine, ACH for short. Which, by the way, acetylcholine is going to tell muscles to do what? To go on. Don't you think there's also neurotransmitter? Well, I mentioned a neurotransmitter, GABA, that tells things to go off. And nicotinic receptors are the exact opposite of acetylcholine. Right? So nicotinic receptors will do what? Nicotine, which is also a neurotransmitter, will tell your muscles and tell your body to do what? To turn things in general off. So think acetylcholine, motor end plate. Again, another thing about acetylcholine, we already talked about calcium starting things, right? Turning things on. Well, acetylcholine now talks about what? Sodium. So let's add that to the list of things that turn things on. So calcium turns muscles on, so does sodium. But we already know that what does potassium do? Potassium turns things, in general, off. So acetylcholine has an on and off switch, as if you can see here. And the electricity is called an action potential. So for example, you have a thought, I want to smack this lady on the side of her head. It's a thought. It's a potential. Do I act upon it? No. Right? So it's a potential to do something. Right? But it is until with everything, all those stuff, all those chemicals engage, then you do what? Boom. Then you go to jail. Question.
What is the correlation of potassium and muscle strength?
Well, potassium turns things off. So let's say, for example, I'm in the middle of a contraction. Contractions always get smaller and then loosen up because after I do my flex, yes, all right, my flex at the gym. I love bros in the gym. This morning, these dudes were, right? Then what happens? Let go. But what happens in a cramp? It contracts, right? Remember, it contracts, and then what? There's no more sodium. There's potassium told what? Oh, let's just stay here. So when you have an imbalance of sodium, calcium, and potassium, that's why whoever tucked you in at night told you what? Drink a glass of water, because what does water always do for us? Keeps us balanced. But when you're dehydrated, don't you think the ions will get out of balance? And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, you get, right? I just love how my wife just rolls over when I'm just in pain or I'm screaming to death, and the kid's like, I heard one of my children just close the door once. I was like, right? And you ever see when your toes cross on top of the Charlie horse because you tried to adjust and then your toes got messed up? For young people in the room, you haven't experienced that yet. When you get older, it's gonna be cool. You'll like it, right? And wait till that happens when you're doing something important like running after one of your kids or running away from a pit bull, that kind of thing. That's happened to me before. Because why? And that's what the imbalance between the on and off. Because when I contract, it's going to be on, and then eventually it's going to what? Go off. But just like the taser, right? There's only what? In the middle or contraction. There's no balance. So then you get the what? And what is the solution? How do you get rid of the Charlie horse? You got to massage it out. And guess what I'm doing? I'm massaging it. Am I not massaging the neuromuscular fibers to do what? Right? To release, to relax, because everything is what? Right? And then you massage it, gets all the ATP out, gets all the other stuff out, and then you drink some water, and then it'll do what? It'll come back. And then you're limping for the rest of the day.
Well, is it a myth of the banana having too much potassium? Or
The funny thing about bananas, someone asked me that. She was a runner in another class in another school. Because in order for you to balance your potassium load, oh, by the way, potassium is measured in milliequivalents. It's kind of less than a microgram. In order for you to adversely or even positively affect your potassium load, you'd have to eat a bunch of bananas. You know what a bunch looks like? It's like this, right? Right? So, because remember, when you eat, how efficient is eating? It's got to break everything down. Right? Now, let's look at the other side of it. How easy can I mess you up if I miscalculate your potassium in your line? Because I can tell you right now, this little change in potassium is like adding what? 2 bunches. I've done that before a couple of times. Miscalculated the potassium load. What happened? My patient went bradycardic because why? I turned off her heart for a little while. She went from a normal like 80, 85 beats per minute, and then it went down gut drive. It goes, for some reason, it goes, her heart rate is at 42. And then I'm like, what was the potassium load that I did? She goes, you put 7 mechs in it. And I go, don't you think you should have told me that? She goes, those were your orders. I checked the math, it looked good. And I'm like, 3 to 5 is the normal. She goes, well, I thought you knew what you were doing. I'm like, apparently I don't. So then what do we have to do? Again, just like massaging it out, I had to do what? Give more water, and then, because I know what turns things on. So I had to do what? Change it a little bit hypertonic, because why? Sodium, right? And then I had to put a little bit potassium carbonate. Now, here's the cool thing about medicine. Everyone gets to see your boo-boos. So just own up, because it's a chart and they read it. And especially now with electronic medical records. The nurse will write, oh, previously at 1 a.m., 85 beats per minute. At 3 a.m., 42. Dr. Garais was notified. And then what happened at 3:04 a.m.? Dr. Garais adjusted meds and did the following, and then everything went back to normal. Don't you think Cassidy, when he wakes up, I don't think he wakes up, he's a freaking vampire. He'll go, well, when he starts looking at charts at 4:30, 4:45, he'll go, what the fudge? What did you just do? And that's exactly what he did. He came up to me around 5:15. I'm like barely finishing my chart. And he said to me, he goes, hey, in the habit of giving my patients bradycardia? I'm like, I know, I messed up. I fixed it. And he goes, and he was like, what did he say to me? Puncturing my tire and then repairing it. Mr. Garais, and he made sure that he called me Mr. Garais. He goes, Mr. Garais is not fixing it. And then he walked out of the room and then he started yelling at some nurses. And I'm like, but then again, in my mind, I fixed it. I'm the one who messed it up, but then I fixed it. And that's actually what actually goes on all day. Remember, we're managing our patient's case. You're too far to the left, what am I do? Right? And then too far to the right, I'm going to move it a little bit over. So that relates to, your question relates to how things turn on and how things turn off. And another way how things turn on and off is neurotransmitters. And also, we now know another way to turn things on and off is what? Action potential, or a signal from your brain. So you can see how kind of complex neurology is. It's not only electrical, it's chemical. And it's like a play on all these things that turn things on and off. We already talked about this in the video, right? And it requires ATP. Now, and you notice that it goes ATP. We don't care about ATP. What do we really care about? We care about breaking that phosphate bond. Remember how the ATP just sits on there and does nothing? But the second that ATPase breaks that bond and makes it ADP plus PI, then what do we got? We have movement of these heads, and then what do we have? We have then the actin and myosin filaments moving closer together, then we have contraction. Now, how do we relax? Well, we have an enzyme, because acetylcholine tells me to do what? Contract, right? But what does an acetylcholine esterase will do? It will break down or eat up all the acetylcholine. So I have no acetylcholine. Therefore, my muscle will go back to what? Its relaxing state. But in reality, you're never really relaxing, especially if you're awake. Like if I'm, no matter, even though I see some of you guys, right? You're sitting in chairs like, right? And you like have sleep or you're on your way, but you still notice you have body tone. You're kind of still sitting up in your seat. But what if, right? And you guys know this. What if you start going to sleep? What happens to your posture? Right? Those of you who have that long drive home later on tonight, your head does this, right? Right? And then you, now, that means what? While you're awake, or even in the first several parts of sleep, you have muscle tone. How's this? Those of you who have like family members, you know, run experiments on them. It's very interesting, especially when they sleep. When they're in REM sleep, and how do you know? Right? Their eyeballs, like you ever see their eyeballs start moving around? Or if they're dreaming, that's when they start talking, right? Oh, and it's really funny because some people, when you, because do you think your brain turns off when you go to sleep? It does the exact opposite. It ramps up when you sleep. And that's why you need to sleep. So it organizes all the thoughts of the day. Well, in REM sleep, do this. Take your partner's arm, or maybe your kids, you know, whoever you don't like, right? You take their arm, put it over their head. If they're if they're in like the first stages of sleep, the second you pick up their arm, they're gonna move around. And then when you let go, they're not gonna hit themselves in the head. But in REM sleep, you have no tone. You turn into, your whole body gets what? Super relaxed. So you take your hand, and what do? You let it go over the head. What happens? They hit themselves, and they don't move around. Especially if someone who's a really heavy sleeper, you kick the bed, you kick them around. In EMS, sometimes we bunk with the FDNY guys, and like I used to, I didn't hang out in the bunk there because I lived, like 60 blocks up. It was easy to take a bus. So every morning or every other morning, there'd be some rookie who's sleeping outside in their bunk because, of course, it's like, that trick. When you're asleep, everyone takes your bunk and then puts you outside with the homeless people, right? And then you wake up like, how did I get out here? And why is that? Because you have no tone and your brain is preoccupied, right? So, and also, how else do you know you have tone when you're moving around? Just you feel around, your muscles are unpacked. But let's say I take a hammer and I bump you over the side of the head, and now you're unconscious. Will you be able to sit up? Right? But let's say you were sitting in your chair, and I don't know, I finally went cuckoo, and I bought a ball peen hammer, and I did what? And then what happened? You'll what? Fall, right? Because there's no more tone. So actually, the relaxation you feel when you're relaxing your arm or relaxing your body isn't total relaxation, because as you're awake, there's always some level of tone. But then what happens if someone has a stroke? Or what happens if someone has a transection of their spine? What happens to the tone? There's no more tone. So after a while, remember, if you don't use it, you lose it. So those of us who worked as a CNA know that what? After time, that's why you have to do what? You have to do your daily exercises with your patient, because if they don't move, what happens? You'll not only have bed sores, but what will happen to your tone? And if your tone goes really bad, acetylcholinesterase will be greater than the acetylcholine. And if there's no signal to your muscles to do anything, your muscles will be like what? Nah, I don't need to build any more protein. All right, you're not using me today. And those of us who coming back to the gym after a while, don't you ever have that complaint like, oh, I'm using muscles that I've never even used before? No, you used them before, but not to the level at which you do. Calcium, of course, sarcoplasmic reticulum. Troponin, tropomyosin complex. Don't have to know about that. Just know that actin, when exposed to calcium, changes. And when it changes, it opens itself up to the myosin heads that has ATP and ADP on it. So this is the reason why a whole bunch of bros walk around. You ever see them? They walk around with like those milk jugs, and it usually has something purple or pink or orange in it, and usually has this creatine powder, all this creatine, because they think what? Somebody somebody out there, right, said, oh, creatine will make you have more ATP. More ATP will have more contraction for muscle. In theory, yes, but we all now know it's just like vitamins, right? Our body likes to eat this stuff, right? Our body likes metabolism. We like to eat food and then make our own creatine. So I can eat all the little protein powder all day. What am I doing? I'm just beating that crud out of my kidneys. How's this? Just eat more red meat, or eat more foods that have whey protein in it instead of all that powder. And a lot of that powder, the creatine as well. So what does this creatine do for us? You can see how the creatine facilitates that ATP to ADP so that we can, and we already now know, in the myosin, the thick head, that's what makes us muscle contract. So if you watch all these the bros in the gym with the little powders every morning, they're all doing it. It's a supplement. You're supposed to eat on top of the powder and not just the powder. So now you know that creatine helps with this phosphate bonding from ATP to ADP, right? So that you have muscle contraction. So if ever you see like, those GNC stores with big jugs, they always come in like big jugs, right? It's like the biggest scam in the fitness industry. There's a whole bunch of scams in the fitness industry. You have all these young people thinking all these powders will make you cut. Same thing. You know how they always say, what does Chris Pratt always tell about? Like, oh, he goes, I do the asparagus diet and all that. No, all y'all do steroids, right? And now we now know what androgens and steroids do for us. It signals the body to do what? Increase muscle mass, increase all of these things. Oh, you do a round, and even the oral ones, but if you inject it, it's much better. I'm not saying to do it, but it makes all of this, right? And and actually that's what professional athletes do all day, every day. And that's why they are 3% body fat. They're not 3% body fat because how many of us ate like birds for months? And you still, lost only a pound or two. And you have these people in Hollywood that lose 30 pounds in 20 days, right? Which is really, really not good for. Like, how does Mark Wahlberg, what is Mark Wahlberg? What is he, 45 now? Right? How does he get so cut up and 3% body fat in 45 days? Right? You're like, because the paparazzi follows these people around, right? And then you see a picture of him in January, right? And he looks like a normal, you ever see Chris Pratt? He looks like a normal human being. Then you put him on a cycle, then he looks like Star-Lord. Oh, by the way, I used to be a production assistant in New York City for a little show called NYPD Blue. Before they get on, they get on camera, and nowadays a lot of it's post-production. Like, I was Benjamin Bratt's assistant for a couple of days. By the way, ladies, he is good looking, but he's not as good looking as he is on TV. But he is a good looking man. But he took off his shirt for not even 10 seconds. He worked out for almost 30 minutes. And my job was to make sure he had water and he had the weight. He was in his little RV, and he's like, and then right, they toweled him down and everything, and on top of it, makeup did what to his ass, and then the camera did what? You know the gym lighting? Isn't the gym lighting the best? I love gym lighting because when I'm in the gym, I can do this. Then you go to your lighting and your mirror at home, and what do you look like? You're like, oh, what happened? My gains. I got to go back to the gym so I can look at my gains. But I love gym lighting, and I love gym mirrors. Gym mirrors has just enough convexivity just to make you a little bit. I feel like I'm a whole 5'5" when I'm at the gym. It feels when I go home or when I take pictures because now my cardiologist wants me to have like body pictures, so he can probably shame me at the end of the month. Right, but it's really to see because the pear shape, or if you are one of these people, such as myself, who gained a lot of your weight here in the middle, the measurements here are direct correlation with coronary disease, and the level. It's actually a direct correlation with your blood work. So it's easier, instead of doing blood work every 30 days, it's easier just to do what? Do a caliper and tape measure your tummy instead of taking your A1C and all that. And that's my new cardiology thing. It's like, take a blood measure, right? Then you take a picture. We go online, and then I charge you $90. Good? We good? Should have stayed a doctor. I would be scamming everybody. So we have anaerobic and aerobic phase, okay? And this is where it gets weird because, well, not weird, but remember the glycolysis was the anaerobic phase. Right? So we already know that glycolysis does not make ATP, but what makes a lot of ATP, right? The aerobic phase. That's why, remember when I talked about like all the bros in the gym who try to max out, but they don't breathe, right? Because if you don't breathe, let's say let's say I'm deadlifting something and you do one of these, what are you doing? No oxygen is coming into the system. If there's no oxygen in the system, will there be any ATP for your muscle contraction? No, right? So it will use whatever oxygen is just floating around for other things. And one of the places that they take the oxygen from is where? Brain. So if your brain doesn't have a lot of oxygen, what's your brain going to do? Oh, no, we're not having this. I'm going to shut off for a little. And then that's when you what? Pass out. But whoever built us knew that we have our own inner bro and we might do that. So what do? We have myoglobin. Myoglobin, just like hemoglobin, hemoglobin is the protein in blood that carries oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now we know myoglobin is a protein in our muscles that's going to carry the extra oxygen so that, you know, when I'm doing my personal record, when I'm PRing, right, go, I don't immediately pass out. And that's myoglobin. And the more muscle I have, the more myoglobin I'll have. And of course, that's the aerobic phase. Aerobic phase requires oxygen, makes ATP, and we definitely know it's part of the mitochondria. And we have muscles that have myoglobin. Globin is a medical suffix, medical terminology suffix. That means protein. Myo means muscle. Muscle fatigue. Okay, of course, decreased flow, and it kind of answers your question about potassium and cramps. So if you work out too much, right, you could have rhabdomyolysis, myo, muscle, lysis, breakdown. We also know another term, which is really, really extreme for especially extreme athletes. You know, these psychopaths who they go in the desert and they run 100 miles. Like that loony Navy SEAL dude, David Goggins, right? Those 100-mile marathons are supposed to be run as a tandem. Like, you know, you got like 6 or 7 of your friends, you tag in. David Goggins, he's a loony. He does it what? By himself. But those are SEALs, that's what they do. So what will happen? You're going to have an ion imbalance, right? But he doesn't believe in loss of desire. But what's really bad, and I don't believe this is controversial, it's what happens. You will have lactic acid buildup. And remember, too much of anything, especially acid, don't you think that will also start breaking down and contribute to your rhabdomyolysis? Yes. So if you work out too much or you do too much work, there will be a point where there's no more ATP and there's no more calcium to be had. And of course, the oxygen that you're taking in isn't enough to make more. So you get cramps and you get pain. And of course, cramps, we already know it's because of electrolyte imbalance, and electrolyte imbalance also could mean a fluid imbalance as well. Heat production. Of course, if I shiver, I make heat. Those of us who, you know, in the winter times, stand in the bus stop, what do? Shake your feet, move around a little bit to keep warm. Now, let's extrapolate this to a patient that's atrophied and doesn't move. What's going to happen? They're going to have what? Significant amounts of heat loss, and they won't be able to make that back. Did you ever notice how warm the sheets are in the hospital? Right? And when you're cold, right, they put what? Another set of warm sheets on top of you. Because why? Are you moving around? And the hospital is not warm. It is a cold place. And blood is important, transports heat throughout the body core. And actually, it's actually what happens. Have you guys heard of shock? Like when they say you're going into shock. You're going into shock doesn't mean, well, it could also mean you were like shocked. Like you said, oh, Dr. Garais, you won $500 million. Of course, your body will have the inability to pump blood to your brain because you're so, and that's called psychogenic shock. Have any of you been so scared that you're like you can't think and you want to pass out? No? Nobody? Yeah? You feel it. You feel drained. You feel that, like, I feel it here. And then right before I pass out, you're like, oh, this is not good. Right? So because you guys know I like being scared. So I did things when I was younger to make myself really scared. Right? So there was a couple of times where like I kind of just like passed out. And it's also because why? Again, shock is the body's inability to transport oxygen to where it needs to go. And where's the most important place? Your brain. So can your brain turn yourself off? Yes, of course. If you've ever had horrible news or something like that, it'll make you do that. You also have cardiogenic shock. That's actually what we're afraid of when you go into heart failure. Because if your heart doesn't work, will you be able to pump oxygen around your body? No. And if you don't pump oxygen around your body will then start to fail. Right? So your muscle contractions and making heat and having all that ATP and calcium move around your body keeps you also what? Alive. And so again, extrapolate that to your atrophied patient or your long-term in-bed patient. Then it complicates matters, doesn't it? Because they don't move around too much. On top of that, if they're older, how is their skin? How is their muscle tone? How is their circulation? And we all don't have to look at the last slide to tell us what. Everything does what? Decrease. And muscle tone, of course, continuous state of partial contraction. And we already know that. We all have, even though some of you are like going in and out a little bit, that's okay. You still have what? Enough tone to keep yourself upright. But if you lose tone, whether you pass out or get bonked over the head or go to sleep, that's when your muscles give out. So how am I on time? I'm being a little bit more cognizant on time. You know me, you let me talk, I'll lecture the whole month. All right, let's 7 more minutes. Okay. So there's types of contractions. Let's and doesn't this look like a beautiful ABC question? So it's already calling out for us. So let's say I pick up a 5-pound weight, right? My bicep can handle 5 pounds, right? So what will happen? My muscle contraction will be able to move this weight up because why? Because the force is greater than this weight, and then what will happen to my muscle? It will get smaller. So this is called a concentric contraction. Con means what? With. So the weight is going where? It's going with me, right? Concentric contraction. So think 5-pound weight, I picked up wheelies. So there is contraction of my muscle. So let's say you're going to try to impress somebody, so you pick up the 85-pound weight, right? Now, no, maybe 85 is a little much. How about 55? 55, you kind of get it off the ground, but are you picking this thing up? Not really. You get it about 1 inch off the ground, and what happens? Is your muscle getting smaller? No, because it barely can pick it off the ground. You won't be able to have any flexion. So that's called eccentric contraction. That means you have barely contraction of your muscle, and the force isn't enough to make movement, to pick up that weight, because that weight is too big. So you have this situation, weight's easy, right? There's definitely contraction. Then you have this situation where there's the muscle can't do it. So that's eccentric contraction. Now, last but not least, you have isometric contraction. Iso means the same. Meter, of course, means measurement. So how does that work? If any of you know anything about isometric exercises, those are exercises where you're not really moving, like, and there's actually no movement, but there is contraction of the muscle. And one example, let's say I'm pushing up against this wall, right? Now, when I'm pushing up against this wall, is there any real movement going on? No, it's a wall. But I'm trying to, right? But I'm contracting, am I? Right? but the contraction is not moving anything. Therefore, it is what? Isometric. Iso means the same. So it's the same movement. So you have a situation here where there's definitely a shortening of the muscle, and I can easily lift that weight. That's called concentric. Then I have eccentric, where I can't even pick this thing up off the ground. So actually, my muscle will even lengthen or stretch because I can't pick this thing up. And last is isometric, right? I'm pushing against something that will definitely not move, like a bar connected to the wall or the wall itself. And those are isometric contractions. If anyone's ever did like isometric exercises, you like get really tense and you're like this, you know, just tighten everything. You guys ever do any of that? No? No one's ever, no? All right, but they're really nice. They're nice for stretching and things like that. So muscle got smaller, I could do the weight, concentric. Muscle kind of got a little longer, but I can't even pick this thing up. That's eccentric. And of course, isometric, I'm just doing what? I'm just squeezing, iso, same, nothing's going anywhere. So those are 3 examples of types of contractions. Now, smooth muscle. What's really important, right? They lack striations, they're not as strong, and of course, they don't need a massive sarcoplastic reticulum, because when I'm eating, am I in any rush to digest this stuff? Typical, not ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is hard. Transit time. Typical transit time through your gastrointestinal tract, like once you eat something and then ends up in the toilet, is anywhere from like 14 to 21 hours. So it takes what? Time. So your smooth muscle has a different agenda than your skeletal muscle. So your skeletal muscle has a lot of sarcoplastic reticulum because I needed to do what? I need to move around quickly. But the smooth muscle, not as quickly. Multi-visceral, they're all the same. But the big thing about visceral, that's also like cardiac, even though they don't form a syncytium like cardiac. Remember, cardiac syncytium, if one cell is going 100 beats per minute and the other cell is going like 60, when they go together, it's going to go 80. Right? They even out and they beat together because they have to contract together because that rhythmicity and the timing is important. But in visceral smooth muscle also has rhythmicity, but in a different way. For example, your peristalsis. When you swallow, it's automatic. So there has to be some sort of coordination. And this is, and because I have to move the food down this conveyor belt called your gastrointestinal tract. So there has to be also rhythmicity. And we'll definitely know that in reverse peristalsis, there's also rhythmicity. Think about the last time you threw up, right? It's coming in waves, isn't it? Right? You're like, oh God, there's gotta be 3, 2, oh, here we go again. Right? You see, it's like a nice little horrible roller coaster. Same thing with diarrhea, right? You're like, oh my God. And then what? Flush, right? You walk a couple of steps like, oh, here it goes again, right? And it comes in what? Waves, right? And that's your visceral smooth muscle. And there's timing to it. Which, by the way, this, you guys probably, because nowadays physicians, we go through the physical examination so fast to the point where many of my colleagues don't even do a physical examination, which is kind of sad. Oh yeah, my cousin just, she's been bleeding for the last 90 days, and all they did was an ultrasound on her. And I'm like, no, you need to do a biopsy. We need to find out where the bleeder is, right? She's like, well, that's what they did. And I go, so how's the bleeding? Still gone, right? Go to another chucklehead. Let's see what happens. And then, of course, now she has a biopsy. Now we see things. And then I'm like, but I can tell you right now, all of these physicians, they went to medical school. They did their board. They're not stupid people. But what happens when you're just going through the motions and trying to get money? You're just going to go through the process. You're going to cut corners. And then what if she bled out? This moron's just doing transvaginal ultrasound. Okay, you're still bleeding. Hello? Of course you are. You have to go take a biopsy to find out what in the endometrium is bleeding. I don't know. Last time I remember. But the one thing we know about rhythmicity is, any of you ever had a doctor put a stethoscope on your tummy, right? Because all those little sounds that you think, you have absolutely no control over, but there's actual rhythmicity to it, and there's actually a sound to it. Like when it gets really bad, when you have like, you ever have like a really bad street taco, and then when the gas kicks back up, it sounds like, it not only feels like rumbling, like something's growing in here, which it is in a way, right? Like this, you feel this, and then you hear like something awful, right? That's called borborygmus. I hear that, then I know what? Oh, that's GI regurg. There's something really hefty going on here. And odds are it's probably severe gastritis, right? And all of us, had something bad from, like, anyone ever have gas station sushi? That's also not a good idea. I will always remember Garais, Indiana because of that. I don't know what was through my mind. I was at a symposium. I was passing through Indiana. Hey, look, I smelled it. It smells okay. I'm like, Garais, Indiana. Let's have some sushi. What could go wrong? Right? So many things. I was admitted the very next night. And what was happening? All those little things, right? Oh, by the way, GI specialist just took one look at me and went, nah. I'm like, did you think Chuckles to do one of these jobbies just to see? No. She went right to what? Ultrasound, and then abdominal plate. Like I said, shortcut, faster, get the money, right? It's one of the 101 reasons why I'm no longer a physician, because when I was a resident, it seems like all the stuff they taught us in medical school went out the window. A lot of it, especially the clinical stuff. And it made me, I don't know, just made me very jaded and very upset. I should have just stayed and just become a nurse like my other colleagues. So think rhythmicity, think heart, cardiac, but also think of visceral smooth muscle and the peristalsis. Okay, how am I on time? Oh, of course I went over. All right. Let me do smooth muscle. I'll wrap it all up, and then we'll have a nice 15 minutes. Sound good to you guys? Now, of course, they all have calcium. They all have ATP. But what's different is that the skeletal muscle uses only one neurotransmitter, and that's acetylcholine. But what does smooth muscle use? Smooth muscle uses acetylcholine and norepinephrine, or norepi. So that looks like a beautiful both A and B, and goes, so 2 neurotransmitters are required for smooth muscle, and only 1 neurotransmitter is required for skeletal. So the skeletal muscle neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, and the 2 neurotransmitters for a smooth muscle is acetylcholine and norepinephrine. So on that note, I will pause. We're good on time. Where's my pause button? Okay, and how does